Hey class, how's it going? This is Mr. Miles coming at you with another podcast, and this is going to be lesson 3.2, so that's chapter 3, lesson 2. And today we're talking about classifying plants and figuring out what different groups plants can fall into. So the first group that we're going to run into are the non-vascular plants. Now this first group, so this right here, this first group, and again, if you're following along in the book, it's going to be on page 90. So this first group, the non-vascular ones, we want to look back to this word that we learned earlier, vascular, and we remember that vascular tissue was the stuff that's going to be transporting materials, whether it be food or nutrients or water throughout a plant. And we remember that in plants they had xylem and phloem doing that. We're going to talk about that more in a second. But just understand that non-vascular means that they don't have this. They don't have this method of transporting it. So that would mean there's a few things that they would have to have in order to survive. Now, if you're not able to transport things long distances, you don't want to have long distances between actually getting materials. When you look at something like a tree, so again, let's say we have a really large tree, and here's a person right here. If you don't have any vascular tissue, this outside may be able to get the CO2 that it needs. It may be able to get the water that it needs. But on the inside of the tree, it wouldn't be able to get any of this because there's no way of transporting it inside. These cells on the outside would take it all up. So the first thing when you're thinking about non-vascular plants is the whole thing is they're going to have thin cell walls because they're just going to have to be taking stuff into their cell walls. They're going to be low to the ground. And they're going to be small. When it comes from comparing to other ones, they're going to be smaller in their structure. Now, this makes perfect sense because again, in order to get the CO2, the H2O, the nutrients it needs to be low to the ground because the ground's where it's getting the nutrients. It needs to be smaller because again, if it's too deep, it won't be able to get any on the inside, and they're going to have very thin walls so they can absorb a lot of nutrients. So let's look at a few different non-vascular plants that we have here. The three that we're going to focus on is the mosses. We're also going to look at the liverworts and the hornworts. Okay, so again, I would advise you to look on page 91, 92, where you can get a lot of these pictures for them. In the book, they show how they are very low to the ground. If you were to zoom in on one of them, you'd be able to see something like this. When we're looking at the moss structure, you'd see something like this. There's a stem coming out of there. We have these things that look like leaves, and I'm a terrible artist. And then we have this. Now, you may be looking at this underground structure and saying, well, that's a root system. Now, remember, root systems only work if there's a way to transport the nutrients being taken in here and transporting it up there. These actually aren't roots. These are what we call a rhizoid. And these are just going to be there to make sure that it stays anchored, that it stays in the ground. That's their primary job, and that's what they're going to be doing. The capsule up here this is going to be holding either the sperm cell or the egg cell for reproduction. Used in that, you have the stalk, which allows it to be up above the ground so that way it can be carried across. And the way that these guys are going to carry this stuff across is they're going to have to use water in order for the sperm cell and egg cell to meet. So again, we'll talk more about it in class. You read more about it in the book, but those are the basics of our non-vascular plants. Now the next ones we're going to run into the next grouping is the seedless vascular plants. Okay, so these ones, they're not going to have seeds, and that kind of gives it away, seedless, but they are going to have vascular tissue, so they are going to have that xylem and phloem. And you should be able to tell me which one's transporting food and which one's transporting water, and remember I gave those little hints, the W, X, Y, Z, and so X, Y to spell, W for water, and Z to pronounce it. And for phloem, that pH makes the F sound, so this is going to be food. So xylem and phloem are going to be able to transport materials throughout the plant. So you can go ahead and guess what the big difference between them and the non-vascular plants are going to be. And that's going to be that these guys can get a lot taller. These guys can get a lot bigger. And if you're looking on page 93, 94, and 95, you see that you have the ferns, you have the club mosses, and don't let this fool you that it says club mosses. This is going to be a different group than the actual mosses, and the horsetails. And you guys have probably seen some of these before. Now, again, these ones are going to be relying heavily on a lot of water to use in reproduction, so you're not really going to see these things, especially you're not going to see any of these things really in Vegas unless you have them there artificially. But this is the next group called the seedless vascular. So they don't use seeds, so they're going to use different ways besides seeds to reproduce, but they are going to have vascular tissue, and it's the ferns, club mosses, and horsetails. Now, the last group that we're going to talk about, but this one splits into a few, so it's going to try and hurt your brain a little bit. So let's start here. So we have the seed plants, and these are the ones that we may be the most familiar with, and the ones that we see the most, that we grow the most. I don't know what that is. But with the seed plants, what you're going to have is you're going to have these, which will use pollen, and these are able to travel. They'll become the sperm cell, and they join with the egg cell in order to make offspring. And it's going to do that by the way of, you guessed it, seeds. So let's talk about the first group of the seed plants, because yes, it breaks down into two. We have the gymnosperms. And gymno, this is going to be naked seed. So that means that all these seeds are going to be exposed. The best way to think of this is think of a pine cone. This is what they use to hold their seeds inside of it. And so we look at our pine cone, and we're used to seeing pine cones, something like this. But if you look at a pine cone after it's already hit the ground, you'll see that each of these little things, which we call scales, each of these will have opened up. And when they open, you can actually see down inside there, and you can actually see the space where the seed is actually stored. And we're going to see different types of gymnosperms. You have the cycads, the conifers, the ginkgos, and the neophytes. And again, these are all on page 97. We are very familiar with the cycads here in Las Vegas. You'll see these ones are going to be the large palm trees. And so they're going to have the naked seed. So there's nothing covering their seed when they have it. Now, the other type of seed plants we're going to get, and these are the very pretty ones, and the ones that you give to your mother for Mother's Day and stuff like that, these are going to be the angiosperms. Whoops. Angiosperms. And these are known as the flowering plants. And their seeds, when they have it, their seeds are going to be protected. They're going to have different things that cover the seeds. Now, again, with angiosperms, we split up again, and we split into two different types. We have either the monocots, or you can have the dicots. And what this cot stands for is cot simply stands for something called a cotyledon. Now, what a cotyledon is this is the food source. The food source for the embryo. So when you have two angiosperms and the sperm cell meets the egg cell, you're going to get an embryo. So this is like what you think of as like the unborn offspring, and it's still growing. This is before the seed will actually germinate, and it needs a food source, and so it uses a cotyledon. And so in angiosperms, you can have two different types. You can have the monocot or the dicot. So mono, as a lot of you know, means one, and di, as a lot of you know, means two. So it's saying that it's one cotyledon or two cotyledons. So how many parts does it have to it? Now there's a nice little diagram down on page 98, and you can see kind of a picture of what it looks like. So sometimes, like when you see a seed, if you split it in half, If it's easy to split in half, it's usually going to be a dicot because they're going to have that nice little slit down the middle. So like looking at something like, it was a bad drawing, but it's like from the side. Let's say we're looking at a seed, and you see kind of like that line already made in there. That's going to be a dicot. It splits nice and easy. Or you can get a single cotyledon, and you can see in that diagram you have a little speck inside of it. If you ever crack open like a pea, you can actually see that, and in there you can see the little embryo, and all this stuff right here would be the cotyledon. We'll actually look at that in class. So again, to recap, our types of plants are going to break up into three main groups of being the non-vascular plants. Then the next ones you're going to get are the seedless vascular plants. And then you get the seed plants. And the seed plants split up into two groups called the gymnosperms and, if it'll let me go, there we go, and the angiosperms, and the angiosperms, and then the angiosperms actually split up into two more groups called the monocots, meaning one cotyledon, or the dicots, meaning two cotyledons. And remember, a cotyledon is the food source for that little embryo that's growing when you have the sperm cell and the egg cell meeting. Okay, so that is it for today. Until next time, I will talk to you later.